affect him? Undoubtedly, that affects him, but he's affected there with the Jews. In regard to his theology regarding, first of all, the theology with Israel fits in with this, but in regard to the theology in regard to Islam and Muslims, he hasn't changed one whit, and neither have any of the other major Christian Zionist evangelicals who have espoused this same thing. So I would say to you, yes, there's something to what you suggested, but I would say don't feel that the theology is not what they believe. And let me cite something I've cited before quickly. A few years ago when I was in Israel, and I talked to Israeli leaders, and I said, don't you know about this theology? They gave me the answer that some of them were my relatives. They gave me the answer that I knew I'd get. They said, we think the theology is nonsense, but we're Machiavellian. We can understand that. Then I went to 3 Christian Zionist groups in Israel. They go for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. And I asked them the same question. I got one answer from them, and from each of them got the same answer. And the one leader from one of the groups put it the best. And this talks to their theology. He said, listen, before I used the term, he said, we know that Israeli Jews think our theology is nonsense. That's what he said. But he said, we're not taking orders from them. We're taking orders from, and he did that. That tells you something.
Who was that?
Huh? That was a name. Wait, that was a guy with a name. I'll tell you his name. Interesting name that I'm not going to forget because it's a name with some Jewish overtones. His name was Joseph Abraham, and he was the head of one of these Christian Zionist groups. I wanted to ask him a little about Abraham since that's my father's name, but well, I didn't do that.
I'm sure he wasn't a Christian Zionist Arab.
No, he was not. No, well, I don't want to utilize it. There's something to say about Christian Zionist Arabs, since indeed some of the people who hate Islam the most in this country use some people who are here, but they're Arabs. They use them as the ones that they say, they use those people to translate those surahs from the Quran that I cited. They use them and they say those are experts on Arabic, which they may be. So there are indeed some, as I'm sure many of you know, there are some people in this country and elsewhere who spread the greatest hatred of Islam who happen to be Arabs.
Just one note, Phil.
Oh, wait just a second. Let Fuad.
May I add just one slight modification here, and that's oversimplification, I think. I was talking to some of these Christian Zionists a while back, and I asked them, how do you square your idea that Christ will come back, will return, and the Jewish belief that Christ actually did not come, that he will come. The Messiah. But Christ, the one we believe in, Israeli was a quack. That's their belief. Now he said, very simply, this is a marriage of convenience. We say Christ will return, and I know I'm oversimplifying the matter. We say Christ will return, and the Jews say Christ will come. The end result is the same. So let's not quibble over terminology.
Okay.
Thanks for the discussion. It's been really interesting so far. So you spoke about some of the Christian Zionist opposition to Chuck Hagel's nomination, and don't you think that the fact that he has walked back some of his positions on Iran and some of his comments that he's made, do you think that that suggests that he actually agrees with the Christian Zionist positions on some of these Middle East issues, and he agrees with
That's an interesting question. As none of us, I presume, were present in the room when he was doing this walk back, it was with a group of leaders of major Jewish organizations at the White House last week that this occurred. Whether he recanted in the sense that he admitted he was wrong, or I would prefer to think that he probably made the case that he doesn't set the policy in the Mideast or anywhere else. He works for the White House, that the White House policy would be X, Y, Z. I would think if he's an honorable man, which I have every reason to think he is, that would have been the way he packaged it. But maybe someone here has heard something different.
Let me just add a point. The objections to Hegel isn't just this. It's the military-industrial establishment in America. He favors, he said publicly, there's a lot of waste and load in the Pentagon budget. That happens to coincide with a lot of the Bible Belt, etc. The manufacturers, like I said, Oklahoma makes bombs. But the point, mainly, the attack on him is the neoconservative, the evangelical, and the military-industrial complex that sees him as a threat to the establishment.
Okay.
I just came back from a trip with Rand Paul. Evangelicals took him to Israel, and while he was there, he made his own arrangements to visit with what's his name, Hussein, Abdullah II, and Mahmoud Abbas, and some others. So he expanded it. The idea of the trip, though, was, well, before I tell you what I think the idea of the trip was, I'd like to ask each one of you your impression of Rand Paul. Is he the kind of person that you think would be reliable as a candidate for the GOP nomination in 2016?
Well, as a matter of fact, I have an article coming out in the American Conservative on the website on Friday, which is an examination of Rand Paul's foreign policy record. And it goes into those issues. It goes into the visit to Israel. I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I was a strong supporter of Ron Paul, and I somehow feel betrayed by Rand. I think Rand is giving every indication of being a politician who wants to get elected president and is figuring out how to do that. And I think he has some advisors who are quite willing to help him with that process. So I don't know. I think the book is still open, but I would be a bit pessimistic at this point. I don't know how the others feel about it.
Anybody else? Have any
I have
views?
a question regarding the military-industrial complex and the goals for obviously, continuing conflict and producing more guns and missiles and, getting money for it all. You mentioned that, the Bible Belt states as senators that are opposed to Chuck Hagel's nomination. Who are they? Is Rand Paul, Kentucky, I believe, right? Is he one of them that would be opposed? And who else would you name as the senators opposed?
Well, we'll see very soon when the vote comes up for Chuck Hagel. But Rand Paul has indicated to cut the waste in the waste in government, the waste in the military. He's said the military budget has to be on the table. That's already a big move for any Republican, and it's hard for them. And I've written a lot. We have a website called the Military Industrial Congress Complex. If you just go Military Industrial Congress, which is the original term Eisenhower used, but it was shortened to Military Industrial. If you just search Military Industrial Congress, I have a website I set up 10 years ago with quotes of all this, which is very explanatory of all these issues.
I just live in Texas. I felt like talking to congressmen, my congressmen, senators over there, or congressmen and senators over there was a little bit of a waste in my time and others' efforts when it comes to this issue. But now that I live in Virginia, I have two Democratic senators, and where I live right now, I actually have it just got redistricted, so I have Democratic congressmen. What can I tell them? We started talking to them, and it seems like seem to be on board. Yes, something needs to be done about this. I approach it and the group that I go with from a human rights perspective, rather than any politics and religion or anything like that. But it seems like even though they are in agreement with a lot of the things we say, not everything, but a lot of it, it doesn't translate to action. Is there anything we're missing? What else do you recommend to do?
Yeah, human rights doesn't buy it, even with a Democrat. I think that the proper argument to use here is, there are two arguments. First one is that we can't afford it anymore. I think that's starting to resonate with everybody. And the second argument to use as a fallback is that really the way we approach these issues, whether it's Libya or Palestine or Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria, has produced no benefit for the United States. So you say the United States has been the loser on all these exchanges because of the policy, the way the policy is driven. Those are the two arguments that I would use. I don't know how the rest of you would see it.
Just as a detached observer of American politics, I stand in awe of democracy as it is practiced here, except for one thing. I get amazed when I see how American politicians of various degrees, and I may be stepping in where angels fear to tread here, how they go groveling to Israelis, how when the Prime Minister of Israel came to meet with George Bush in the White House, in his office, and George Bush just simply suggested, a cessation of settlements. And the Israeli Prime Minister, the Prime Minister of the smallest country in the world, I think, simply said, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And yet, you see objections to the nomination of Hagel. And I think the main reason is this religious issue. In the states where democracy guarantees that everyone can practice his own religion, everyone is free, that there is a separation between church and state. As a person looking from the outside, I see this working very well, except when it comes to the relations with Israel and to relations with Arabs and Muslims. This is something which really amazes me all the time.
My background is psychotherapy, so kind of looking at this in a different kind of lens. I used to work with addicts, drug addicts, and alcoholics. When you talk this language, I'm hearing something, a narrative that's very intoxicating, whether it's the Islamic version of the end times and the coming of the Mahdi, or the Christian version of the end times and the coming of Christ. It's very simple. It's very intoxicating. And I think simple people that don't have much hope are very much attracted to this intoxicating narrative, whether they're in Pakistan or whether they're in the heartland. If we don't have a narrative to give people, and you're wanting a rational narrative, thinking of rationality will trump poetry in a sense, intoxicating poetry, you may not find it. We have failed to find some kind of narrative that will galvanize people. I'm going to go back to the 60s just for a moment. This is maybe a bad example, or maybe it's a good one. When Kennedy talked about doing things overseas and putting one's country before oneself, it was something that caught our imagination. This religious stuff is an intoxicant. It catches people's imagination, and it frames the world in a lens that explains everything. Complex answers don't always work with simple people unless there's, and I realize there's a political level which is different, but on the level of narrative, is there a way to offer people some framework that will be as attractive? And I think we fail to do that, and that's why the extreme philosophies and this apocalyptic brew, which is very, very dangerous, is very attractive.
Absolutely, what you say is the question, if you didn't hear, is the attraction for simpler people or the many people who are passed by economic prosperity, who seek solace, that in all cultures, that was the question, all countries. I lived many years in the third world, and I completely agree that that is the appeal. And I mentioned in my talk the various studies of particularly in America, many evangelicals felt threatened by the government, first by the what they call anti-religious laws, the schools, the pervasive modern culture, which they feel undermines their morals. And that is the support for the movement. And certainly one answer is having more prosperity for everyone, but we can't do that. But that's the strength of the movement in all the different countries. As I also said, the extremists feed off each other in every of the three religions. And that's the strength of it. It's harder to go ahead. You have another.
Yeah, I mean, Americans used to believe in national greatness too. I mean, at the time of Kennedy, that was the thing. I mean, we all believed in a manifest destiny, if you want to talk about that, as Americans. But that, of course, died with Vietnam and with the social upheavals of the 60s and 70s. So that kind of went away. I think I owe someone on this side, right? Here you go.
I think there's something very ahistoric about the hostility to Islam that is being presented by Christian Zionists, by neoconservatives, and by many Jews. My question is, how do all these groups respond to the history of Jews living in the Muslim world peacefully, equality for thousands of years? In 1492, when Jews were expelled from Spain, they were welcomed into the Ottoman Empire. So the history of Jewish-Muslim relations is really much better than the history of Jewish-Christian relations in Europe at the same time. So how would those who are launching their assault on Islam respond to that history?
Well, it depends on who they have listened to and are listening to. If they're listening to a good many of the right-wing Zionists, then they're hearing quite an opposite narrative from the one that you, Alan, have just stated. I'm not saying that the narrative they're hearing is correct, but the narrative they're hearing is how bad it's been for Jews in the Arab world, and that's why so many of them have left and come to the state of Israel, and they talk about how bad it's been, not how good it's been, and do they fabricate? I think the answer to that, and I've looked at a lot of this stuff, is definitely yes, but I'm now not talking about what is fabricated or not, or what's valid or not. They hear quite the opposite. And you don't have to go to Israel to hear it from right-wing Israelis. You can hear plenty of that, as many of you know, in the United States from many of the extreme Israeli apologists in the United States who will say the same thing. So I'm saying, look, I think that what you're suggesting in essence and in substance is correct. And let us assume for a moment that we're right in saying that. Well, if the question is, why do others not believe it, Jews and non-Jews, it's because they're hearing, again, as I've said, different narratives, and the people who are putting the different narrative, oftentimes, in many parts of our societies, they've done a better job of selling the case than those of us who would argue otherwise.
And again, if I may add a personal note here, I'm approaching 80 years of age, and I've lived most of this time in Syria, in Damascus. I do not remember one incident where we even knew that somebody is a Jew or a Christian. And This has been the tradition. Jews were so prosperous that when we as children were taken to a doctor, the Jewish doctor was preferred by our parents. They were a very well-respected and prosperous community in Syria. Now, in 1947, and I remember that very clearly, some of my friends in the high school, Jewish, they were saying, we are now threatened if we do not leave for Israel, because we are hearing, and they used to receive notes and letters by mouth through oral correspondence, that if you stay, then you are going to be blamed for what has happened in Palestine. And they personally told me, we have to leave. We cannot stay. We're threatened not by you and Syrians, but we're threatened by those who tell us that if we don't leave for Israel, then we will be subject to their attacks. This has happened, and the result is they left. Now the propaganda is that they were driven out of Syria and of the Arab world, that their lands, their properties were confiscated and they had to leave. That did not happen. And I think the analogy of Jews being expelled from Spain, this is observed by many of the historians, Western historians, that they were given refuge by the Ottoman Empire, which is always accused of being extreme, anti-Christian, anti-Jewish. But this is, as Norton said, I think the ones who are louder usually get believed.
You know, by having watched and observed this region, the Middle East region, for many, many years, it seems to be the significant problem in the Middle East is radical Islam. We have it in Pakistan. We have it in Afghanistan. We have scathing comments of Khomeini and Ahmadinejad from Iran about Israel and about the great state of the United States. We have problems, sir, in your country right now where 60,000 innocent people have been killed. Radical Islam has worked its way into Syria. We have a very serious situation in Yemen. There is a dislike between the Saudis and Iran. We also have a very difficult situation right now with the Muslim Brotherhood inside of Egypt. Israel's borders before the Arab Spring were relatively secure. We also have the Emir of Qatar, who just gave $400 million to Hamas, who will not acknowledge Israel's right to exist as a state. The other thing is, who does Israel make peace with? Abbas hasn't been able to deliver. Hamas certainly doesn't sound like they want to make peace. But all we hear is it's a Christian Zionist problem. They're the reason that there isn't peace in the Middle East. But if you look at the Middle East, it's obviously that that's not the problem. It's radical Islam.
Well, you're acting like there's only one problem in the Middle East, and that it's radical Islam.
I'm talking about the most extreme problem.
Please, can I finish?
Certainly.
Yeah, you're acting like Israel is not a player in creating its own problems. I mean, Israel has basically thrown away numerous opportunities for peace. No, the Saudi plan in 2003, there have been a number of overtures by Arab countries to try to make peace with Israel. Israel has always felt that, supported by the United States, it has basically a military monopoly and has been able to exercise that to keep the Arabs on their toes.
So what about Camp David of 2000, when Arafat had almost everything he wanted but the sovereignty over the
That's been misreported. I'm not going to argue about footnotes and things here, but
are facts.
Well, let me just answer you by pointing the following out. Today we're talking about Christian Zionism, and I don't think I heard anyone up here, and this certainly includes myself, say that the problems in the Middle East were problems that were caused primarily or only by evangelical Christian Zionists. We were saying a lot of other things about connections, but we didn't say that, and I certainly wouldn't say that either. And if you would ask me, you and I are probably going to disagree, because I would say to you, the heart center problem is the Zionist character of the state of Israel, and that happens to be heart center rather than Christian Zionist. But that's it. Wait a minute, that's an issue, and that's a topic for another day, and I'm certainly willing to discuss that with you, but I'm saying it's not quite fair to say we said Christian Zionists have caused all the trouble in the Middle East. We didn't say it, and we don't believe it.
A key point is Arafat and Abbas turned down Barak and Olmert's generous offers.
Let's you and I talk about that together after the meeting.
Okay. Let's get another viewpoint. Michelle, you, and then you next.
Yeah, I'd like to turn to the question of Jerusalem and the question of Jewish extremism and fanaticism. I've been studying a slice of Jewish fanaticism for a number of years, and where I've seen that the theology of Christian Zionism and Israeli fanaticism come together, Jewish fanaticism come together, is in the question of Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Now, I raise this because I think it puts this discussion in a non-academic setting, because what is being talked about by the Hilltop youth, the illegal settlers, is blowing up the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This was also talked about by a member of the new Jewish Home Party that just won 12 seats in Israel when he came to the United States and spoke at a church in Winter Park, Florida, a Christian Zionist church. And they all come together in something called the Biblical Archaeology Review in London, which has been operating for years, and adds to the mix by saying that the third temple of Jerusalem is going to be part of this Armageddon and the second coming or the first coming and so forth. So this is live, it's now. Channel 2 Israeli TV and other valiant Israeli fighters against Jewish fanaticism and against the refusal to expand the settlements inside Israel are very concerned about this. And I'd like you to situate this war over Jerusalem in this context if you can. In my view, the Christian Zionists in America are actually funding terrorism by sending money to the settlers and so forth. And it's been going on for years, and there's not much done about it. So you've got the double standard, which is, I think, what we're all concerned about here. Thank you.
Well, Michelle, I mean, the quick answer to that is that, sure, when Christian Zionists and others send money that ultimately winds up in the settlements and arms the settlers in some cases, obviously there have been reports of that. Yeah, you're funding terrorism, but the whole problem with terrorism is that it's an infinitely elastic word, and it depends on who's doing the definition. And I wouldn't consider necessarily groups like Hezbollah in their current situation to be terrorists. In fact, the European Union doesn't agree that Hezbollah is a terrorist group, but in the United States, it's universally described as a terrorist group. So anyway, it comes down to definitions, and it comes down to legalisms, and that's the problem.
Concerning this question of the sincerity of theology of people like John Hagee, I think you need to be reminded that American fundamentalism, it's really hard to draw a line between hucksterism, charlatanism, and theology in the history of American fundamental religion. Going back to the fact that maybe these people, some of them think they're sincere, but they've been schooled in a Bible school with the Schofield Bible. Maybe, I don't know if you know about the origin of the Schofield Bible, but
Well, some of us know a lot about the
when
Schofield
you have
Bible.
hucksterism, you have this weakness for wherever the money is. On the other hand, you have the people who are willing to give the money, and this is not just a recent know who they are. Can you comment on that?
Martin, you might comment on that.
Well, obviously, there's a good deal to what you've indicated about the influence of money. But then I suppose the only way to try to determine this, and we know we can't crawl inside people's heads, and we can't crawl inside people's hearts. Sometimes the evidence is pretty clear about whether a person is sincere in religious belief or not, or sincere in something else or not, but oftentimes it's not clear. But I would say that the only way to really try to go at that is to take the people about whom we're talking or the leaders and look at them specifically. Now, I'm sure there are differences among evangelical Christian Zionist leaders. Are there some Elmer Gantrys involved who are in it for the money? Even without knowing, we could say almost certainly yes. But does that mean that that is the case for all of them? I would say almost certainly we can say no. For how many? Maybe we can't say, but then we have to look at who they are, how they've been, and so on. We also know something else, or should know something else. Sometimes it's possible for a person to be influenced by more than one thing. That person can be influenced by sincere religious belief, as you put it, and also be influenced even a little more by some money that may come in. So it's difficult to measure, but again, I can only draw upon the studies that I've done and the research I've done and what I know from what many other people have done, and I think I can say with some assurance, or with some, I believe this, that a great many, a number of the leading evangelical Christian Zionists are sincere in their theology. And of course, the problem there is, as I think we all know, people who believe they are doing God's command and they're acting under God's orders, those people are extremely difficult to deal with if one wants to change their mind. And if they're doing things that we think are wrong and are bad, it's all the more difficult to try to convince them otherwise, because what human is going to be able to convince somebody who believes she or he is working in accordance with God's word? What human is going to be able to convince that person who sincerely believes that to believe or to do something opposite? That's the question.
One more here and then over there.
Well, in fact, I don't have a question. I have just a recommendation for this gentleman here. I'm recommending that maybe he should read some of the Hebrew paper. Maybe he can distinguish between the official propaganda of the Israeli and government and the Zionist movement here, and between reality, what's going on from Israeli Jewish writers.
That's correct. You get discussions of these issues in Israel that don't take place in the United States. I would recommend either the conservative paper, the Jerusalem Post, or Haaretz, which is much more liberal. But I read them every day.
I do too.
Yeah, I read them every day.
I spend 2 months a year in Israel, so I
Okay.
have a lot of Palestinian friends.
Okay.
I was curious to hear some of your recommendations, given that sort of the extent to which Islamophobia is an acceptable sort of viewpoint in mainstream American culture, especially post 9/11, and just kind of thoughts about the way that this is possible because Islam is not necessarily known, and so it can be characterized to an ignorant public as like a religion of Satan. So thoughts about how maybe to address that. You know, one thing I've heard recommended is, you know, maybe get wealthy Arab monarchies on board to kind of have more education about what Islam means, and also maybe you know, the gentleman who was commenting on sort of fundamentalist Muslims in other parts of the world, that perhaps just greater understanding of religion across the board would help.
Well, I mean, a good first step would be to tell Congress to shut up. and but that's not going to happen. I was a CIA officer for 20 years working on terrorism issues, and it's interesting to note that I started out in Italy and Germany in the 1970s. Terrorists were Europeans back then. So terrorism is not a uniquely Muslim characteristic. It's something that groups that are powerless, relatively speaking, vis-a-vis their governments and vis-a-vis the security services, it's a tactic that they use. Now, the problem is that Muslims have been labeled with this Muslim equals terrorist, Islam equals terrorism. This is a false equation, just like the arguments about Sharia law taking over the United States is a false argument. What I would say to you is, let's build some consensus to be respectful of what everybody else is saying, but let's discuss the issues in a serious way and in an honest way. Peter King, for example, with his congressional committees looking at the Islam and to deport Muslims and to take away their civil rights and stuff like this is the wrong way to go about it. I mean, it's not exactly, we don't criminalize other groups in the same way as we do Muslims. But my viewpoint, I guess, would be that we need a lot more airing of these issues in the media. We need a lot more groups like this getting together and just talking about them and seeing where we can come up with what we can come up with at the end of the day.
Yeah, just a suggestion. I have become addicted to watching television on Sunday and all of these Christian evangelist programs. And I defer to our psychologist here. Literally thousands of people listen to these people, listen to the preachers when they say Islam is evil, Muhammad is a terrorist. Those thousands, many of them are really well educated, and they have their, a background of intellectual achievements. How do you counter that kind of mass propaganda? To me, that's the problem. And I cannot but say that we Muslims have our terrorists. We have groups. I shy away from the term fundamentalist because fundamentalist in Islam, a fundamentalist is a person who goes back to the sources of religion, not to any interpretations, any extreme interpretations of the text. Now, it's been now known here as a fundamentalist Muslim is a radical Muslim, is a terrorist, is a, evil. Be that as it may, but we do have our terrorists. And I think the silence of the majority of Muslims against those radicals, extremists, encourages them, just as the silence here that I see against those radicals. Now, when I look at the video which John referred to of the meeting, the Christian Zionists for Israel, where I looked at the people who were there. Now, there was Joe Lieberman, there was Tom DeLay, there was Santorum, and a few others of people who are legislators in the States. And Tom DeLay said, I wish it would come tomorrow. I'm waiting for the day. And the interviewer jokingly said, would you give me your car before you go? He said, yeah, definitely. Now, this used to be I think the leader of the majority in the United States House of Representatives. I can't understand how a person who is a legislator, who is supposed to be the referee of separation of church and state, can be of this mentality. And that, I think, is a fault with the system, because there aren't as many voices that would correct this tendency.
Okay. All right, well, thank you all very much for being here with us today.